Welcome to Echoes of War and Battles, History You Missed. Today we're diving deep into the war that changed everything. And if this is your first time here, kindly hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And to returning viewers, stay blessed. The Second World War was more than just a chapter in the story of humanity. It was the event that redefined civilization itself. It was the moment when every corner of the earth, from the frozen waste of Siberia to the jungles of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the vast oceans that bound the continents, became a battlefield. No other conflict before or since has drawn so many nations, so many people, into a single relentless struggle for survival and supremacy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world that emerged was utterly transformed. Empires that had stood for centuries were in ruins. Entire cities lay shattered. Tens of millions were dead, soldiers, civilians, children, the old, the innocent. The war had not merely redrawn borders, it had redrawn the human soul. But to understand the magnitude of this conflict, we must begin with a simple truth. World War II was not inevitable. It was the result of fear, ambition, hatred, and hope, colliding on a global scale. It was born from the same contradictions that drive history itself: the thirst for power, the dream of freedom, and the darkness that lies between them. When war broke out in 1939, few could have imagined its reach. Within months, battles raged across Europe. Within years, the flames had spread to Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Over 60 nations took part. Every ocean became a war zone. Every sky was a battlefield. For the first time, humanity waged total war, where entire populations, not just armies, became instruments of conflict. Farmers grew food for soldiers they'd never meet. Factory workers built weapons they'd never see fired. Women stepped into the roles of men, keeping nations alive as the front lines consumed millions. From the Arctic Circle to the equator, from London's blackout nights to Tokyo's firestorms, the war reached into every home. It was not just fought with bullets and bombs, but with ideas, with propaganda, ideology, and belief. At its core, World War II was a clash of visions for the future of humankind. On one side stood the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, driven by dreams of conquest, racial hierarchy, and absolute control. They promised revival and greatness but delivered death and tyranny. Opposing them were the Allies, a loose, uneasy coalition of democracies, empires, and communist states, united not by shared ideals but by a common enemy. Britain fought for survival. The Soviet Union fought for vengeance. America fought for freedom. China fought for its very existence. Behind the smoke and steel lay a deeper battle, one for the soul of the modern world. Would humanity submit to authoritarianism, where might makes right and the individual means nothing? Or could freedom, equality, and cooperation survive the darkest storm? The answer was paid for in blood. The numbers are staggering, so vast they almost lose meaning. Over 70 million people perished. Civilians accounted for more than half of the dead. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, an industrialized genocide that revealed the full horror of human cruelty. Entire cities vanished overnight: Warsaw, Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. In the East, the rape of Nanking and countless other atrocities scarred generations. Yet the war's horror wasn't confined to the battlefield or the camps. It lived in the silence of empty villages, in the faces of widows waiting for men who would never return, in the hunger of displaced millions wandering a shattered continent. And still, amid the ruin, there was resilience. There were acts of courage that defied imagination. Partisans fighting in the mountains, resistance networks saving lives under the eyes of tyranny, soldiers holding impossible lines not for conquest, but for hope. World War II was both humanity's lowest fall and its finest hour. Behind the morality and the suffering, another struggle raged, one of power and empire. The war exposed the old world order as fragile, outdated, and doomed to collapse. Britain and France, the empires that had ruled the globe for centuries, emerged bankrupt and broken. The United States and the Soviet Union, once peripheral powers, now stood astride the world like giants. This was the dawn of a new age, the bipolar world of the Cold War, born directly from the ashes of World War II. The balance of power had shifted forever. The atomic bomb had rendered distance meaningless. The old colonial empires began to crumble, as nations across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East demanded the freedom that war had promised but not yet delivered. The struggle for global influence, for ideological supremacy, for control of resources and minds, it all began here in the crucible of 1939 to 1945. World War II was not just fought with men and guns, it was a war of machines, science, and invention. The Industrial Revolution had already changed the way humans lived. The Second World War changed the way they killed. Tanks became faster and deadlier. Aircraft evolved from fragile biplanes to jet-powered monsters. Submarines stalked the oceans. Rockets screamed into the sky. The radar, the computer, the nuclear chain reaction. All were born or perfected under the pressure of war. Technology became the decisive weapon. Entire cities could be destroyed from the air. Messages could cross oceans in seconds. Medical advances, born from necessity, saved countless lives. Penicillin, blood transfusion, trauma surgery. The same scientific brilliance that unleashed horror also paved the way for the modern world we live in today. The war was a paradox. It destroyed the past but built the future. And though the guns have been silent for over 75 years, World War II has never truly ended. Its consequences still shape our lives. The borders it redrew define nations. The alliances it forged, NATO, the United Nations, still underpin global politics. The lessons it taught, and sometimes failed to teach, echo in every modern crisis. Every time a leader speaks of appeasement, they recall Munich 1938. Every time the world fears a nuclear standoff, it remembers Hiroshima. Every refugee crisis, every question of human rights, every warning about fascism or propaganda, all trace their roots back to that 6-year storm. World War II remains the lens through which we understand conflict, morality, and the power of human choice. It reminds us that evil does not vanish when a war ends, it only changes its face. That freedom, once lost, is never easily regained. That technology without conscience can destroy faster than it creates. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is not distant. It lives with us. It breathes in the cities rebuilt from rubble, in the silence of memorials, in the fading tattoos on survivors' arms. Imagine it for a moment. The front lines stretched across 40 nations. In the Soviet Union, battles raged over thousands of miles. Tank divisions fighting in snowstorms so fierce that engines froze. In the Pacific, naval fleets spanned oceans larger than continents. In Europe, bombers flew night after night, their pilots praying to survive another mission. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Shipyards launched vessels faster than they could be named. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives learned to weld. The entire machinery of civilization turned toward war. And yet, amid all this chaos, there was purpose, sometimes misguided, sometimes noble. For those who fought against tyranny, it was a battle for everything worth preserving. Liberty, justice, the right to exist. For those consumed by ideology, it was the ultimate crusade, the belief that destiny itself could be conquered. That is what made World War II unique. Its totality. It wasn't a war between armies, it was a war between entire worlds. So why, after 8 decades, does World War II still capture our imagination? Because it was the mirror of our nature, showing both the darkness and the light within us. It proved what humanity is capable of, for better or worse. It was the moment when civilization nearly destroyed itself, and somehow rebuilt. Every technological innovation, every political alliance, every moral debate about right and wrong that defines the modern era, all trace their lineage back to those years between 1939 and 1945. To forget it would be to forget who we are. Because the story of World War II is not just a story of armies and empires. It's the story of ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary times. It's the story of how the world ended once and how, against all odds, we brought it back again. Kindly subscribe and tell us what you think in the comments section. The seeds of the Second World War were sown not in 1939, but in the ashes of 1918. When the First World War ended, the world believed it had witnessed the war to end all wars. 4 years of slaughter in the trenches of Europe had left nearly 20 million dead and entire empires in ruins. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent, and humanity exhaled in relief. But beneath the silence, something darker began to stir. At Versailles in 1919, the victors of the Great War gathered to shape a new world. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a vision of peace through democracy and self-determination. Britain and France, however, came seeking vengeance and security. Germany, defeated, humiliated, and bankrupt, was forced to sign a treaty that stripped it of its colonies, its pride, and its future. It was made to pay reparations so vast that even the most optimistic economists called them impossible. The German army was reduced to a token force. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The guilt for the war, every death, every scar, was placed squarely on Germany's shoulders. For the Allies, Versailles was justice. For Germany, it was humiliation, a wound that would fester for 20 years until it bled again. Across Europe, millions of soldiers returned home to find their nations broken. In Russia, revolution had already erupted, the old Tsarist regime swept aside by Lenin's Bolsheviks. In Italy, veterans wandered the streets without jobs or honor. In Germany, angry mobs clashed in the streets as communists and nationalists fought for the future of the nation. The war to end all wars had not ended conflict. It had merely changed its shape. The 1920s were an uneasy peace. For some, especially in America, they were a decade of roaring optimism, jazz, automobiles, skyscrapers, and wealth. But beneath that glittering surface, the world economy was fragile. The United States held most of the world's gold. Europe, still rebuilding, depended on American loans to survive. Germany borrowed to pay reparations. Britain and France relied on those payments to repay their own debts to Washington. It was a house of cards built on credit and hope. Then came 1929. When the New York Stock Exchange crashed, the tremors were felt across the world. Banks collapsed. Factories closed. Trade evaporated. By 1932, unemployment in Germany had reached nearly 30%. In the United States, lines for bread stretched around city blocks. The Great Depression was not just an economic disaster, it was a political one. Desperation is fertile soil for extremism. In times of hunger, people look not for compromise but for certainty. They look for strong voices, simple answers, and someone to blame. Across Europe, those voices began to rise, loud, angry, and seductive. In Italy, a war veteran named Benito Mussolini promised to restore national pride. He called his movement Fascismo, after the Roman symbol of authority, the fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an axe. To Mussolini, democracy was weak. Only discipline and unity could save Italy. In 1922, he marched on Rome with his followers, the Black Shirts, and the king, fearing civil war, handed him power. Fascism had taken its first seat at the table of nations. Mussolini's success inspired imitators across Europe. But none would be more dangerous than a failed Austrian artist who rose through the chaos of the German streets. In 1919, Adolf Hitler was a bitter, unemployed veteran in Munich. He joined a small nationalist party, the German Workers' Party, and discovered he possessed a gift, the ability to speak to the anger of a broken people. His voice, shrill and hypnotic, carried the pain of millions who felt betrayed by their leaders and crushed by the Treaty of Versailles. By 1923, Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, attempted a coup in Munich, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed miserably. Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. But his defeat was only temporary. In prison he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a manifesto of hatred and ambition. He laid out his vision of a racially pure Germany, the superiority of the Aryan race, and the need for Lebensraum, living space, for German expansion. He promised to destroy communism, crush the Jews, and rebuild Germany's might. The book was largely ignored at the time, but for those who read it carefully, it was a prophecy of terror. When Hitler was released, the economy seemed to recover briefly, and the Nazi movement dwindled. But the Great Depression revived it. By 1932, with millions unemployed and hopeless, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany. Their message was brutally simple. Germany did not lose the war. It was betrayed. We will rise again. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, under pressure from conservative elites, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. They believed they could control him. They were wrong. Within months, the Nazis burned the Reichstag, banned opposition parties, and created a one-party totalitarian state. The swastika replaced the flag of the Republic. Books were burned. Jews were boycotted. Teachers, judges, soldiers, all were forced to swear loyalty to the Führer. The world watched and hesitated. The 1930s were a decade of denial. Britain and France, haunted by the slaughter of the First World War, were desperate to avoid another conflict. Their economies were weak. Their people wanted peace, not politics. So when Hitler rearmed in secret, they looked away. When he sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, they protested but did nothing. Hitler gambled everything on the belief that the democracies would not act. He was right. At the same time, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, a sovereign African nation, using poison gas and machine guns against tribesmen with spears. The League of Nations, created after World War I to preserve peace, condemned the aggression but imposed weak sanctions. The message was clear: the League could talk but it could not act. In Spain, civil war erupted in 1936. Republicans, backed by Soviet aid, fought against General Francisco Franco, who was supported by Hitler and Mussolini. It was a dress rehearsal for World War II, German bombers testing their weapons over the Spanish town of Guernica, slaughtering civilians in one of the first terror bombings of modern warfare. Meanwhile, far to the east, Japan pursued its own ambitions. Japan had emerged from World War I as a regional power, but its leaders believed they were destined for more. In 1931, without authorization from its government, Japanese military officers staged an explosion on a railway in Manchuria, China, the Mukden Incident, and used it as an excuse to seize the region. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Japan simply walked out of the League. The world again did nothing. Japan built a puppet state called Manchukuo, and its expansion continued. In 1937, Japanese forces invaded China outright, launching a brutal campaign that shocked even their own allies. In Nanking, hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered. Women were raped, prisoners executed, hospitals burned. The rape of Nanking became one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Across Asia, Japan proclaimed it was liberating the continent from Western colonialism. In truth, it was building its own empire through blood and fire. The world, still gripped by economic crisis and isolationism, turned inward. As the 1930s progressed, diplomacy collapsed. The League of Nations, once the great hope for peace, had failed to stop aggression in Manchuria, Ethiopia, or Spain. Its inability to act emboldened dictators everywhere. And in the heart of Europe, Hitler's ambitions grew bolder. He promised to reunite all German-speaking peoples. In 1938, he annexed Austria, the Anschluss, without firing a shot. When Britain and France protested, he assured them it was merely self-determination. The cheering crowds in Vienna convinced many that perhaps he was right. Next came Czechoslovakia, a young democracy with a strong army and alliances with France and Britain. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. The Czech government refused. Europe stood on the brink of war. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet Hitler. After tense negotiations, he agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for peace. Returning to London, Chamberlain declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." Less than a year later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had failed. The dictators had learned the truth. The democracies would sacrifice others for peace, until their own turn came. By 1939, the world was divided between two visions: democracy and dictatorship. In Germany, Nazism had become a religion. In Italy, fascism promised a return to Roman glory. In Japan, the emperor was worshipped as a living god. Across the oceans, Stalin's Soviet Union stood as another kind of totalitarian state, one built on fear, purges, and forced labor. Between them lay the fragile democracies of the West, unprepared and divided. Drop a comment. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments section and where you're watching from. Thank you. The stage was set for catastrophe. In August 1939, in a move that stunned the world, Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. A marriage of convenience between two mortal enemies. The pact cleared the way for war. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Once again, Europe was at war, but this time the conflict would spread far beyond its shores. The tragedy of the interwar years was not simply that war came again, but that the world had every chance to stop it. At each step, Manchuria, Ethiopia, Spain, Austria, Czechoslovakia, the aggressors tested the world's will and found it wanting. Appeasement was born from fear. Fear of another bloodbath, fear of economic ruin, fear of the unknown. But in trying to avoid war, the world only ensured that when war came it would be far worse. It is easy in hindsight to judge those years as weakness. But to understand them is to see the exhaustion of an entire generation. The veterans of the trenches had seen horror beyond words. Their sons would soon see it again, magnified 1,000-fold. As summer faded into autumn in 1939, Europe, the Blitzkrieg had begun. Within weeks, Poland was carved in two, Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east. Civilians fled in panic. Refugees crowded every road. The world had entered a storm unlike any before. And this time the war would not be confined to Europe. It would reach the deserts of Africa, the jungles of Burma, the snows of Russia, and the islands of the Pacific. It would involve every race, every nation, every ideology. The peace that had been promised in 1919 was shattered. The world was burning again, and this time the fire would engulf the planet. Blitzkrieg, the fall of Europe, 1939 to 1941. The world had fallen asleep in peace. It woke in fire. On the 1st of September 1939 at dawn, German troops crossed the Polish border. Moments later, the Luftwaffe roared overhead, waves of bombers and screaming Stuka dive planes tearing through the morning sky. Columns of tanks, armored cars, and motorized infantry rolled forward in perfect coordination. To the stunned defenders of Poland, it felt less like an invasion and more like a natural disaster, a storm of steel that no human force could stop. Europe had witnessed invasions before, but nothing like this. This was Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. The Blitzkrieg was not just a military tactic, it was a revolution in warfare. In the First World War, armies had dug into trenches, grinding forward a few yards at a time at the cost of millions of lives. The German generals of 1939 were determined never to repeat that nightmare. Instead, they unleashed speed, coordination, and surprise as weapons. Airplanes would strike first, disrupting communications and paralyzing defenses. Tanks would spearhead deep thrusts into enemy territory, supported by mobile infantry and artillery. The enemy would be encircled, isolated, and destroyed before they could react. It was war conducted with the precision of an industrial machine, and it was terrifyingly effective. Within days, Polish forces were shattered. Their cavalry, brave but obsolete, charged tanks with sabers and lances. Cities were bombed mercilessly. Refugees filled the roads only to be strafed from the air. Then, on September 17th, the final betrayal came. From the east, Soviet troops poured into Poland under the terms of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Caught between two invading armies, Poland was crushed. Warsaw surrendered after 27 days of defiance. The nation that had been reborn after the First World War ceased to exist. The Western powers, Britain and France, declared war on Germany as promised. But for months they did almost nothing. From the autumn of 1939 to the spring of 1940, Europe entered a strange, uneasy silence. Along the Western Front, millions of soldiers waited behind fortifications that stretched from the Alps to the North Sea. The French believed themselves secure behind their Maginot Line, a vast series of concrete bunkers and artillery posts built to resist a German attack. Newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. No major battles were fought. Allied soldiers drilled, played cards, and waited for orders that never came. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery and the whispers of dread. But inside Germany, the factories were alive with activity. The Wehrmacht was preparing its next blow, one that would make the world tremble. In April 1940, Hitler struck again, this time in Scandinavia. Denmark was conquered in a single day. Norway, with its strategic ports and access to iron ore, resisted longer but soon fell. The invasion shocked the world, not only for its speed but for the daring use of airborne troops, naval forces, and coordinated air support. Britain and France sent help, but too late. The campaign exposed their indecision and disorganization. Hitler's confidence soared. The German army seemed unstoppable. Next came Western Europe. In the early hours of May 10, 1940, the storm returned. German forces launched a massive offensive against France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The Allies expected an attack through Belgium, just as in World War I, and rushed their best forces north to meet it. But Hitler's real plan lay elsewhere. Through the dense, supposedly impassable forests of the Ardennes, German tanks advanced in secret. Roads clogged with armor, supply trucks, and motorcycles. An entire mechanized army threading through mountain passes that Allied generals thought no army could cross. In just 5 days they broke through. By May 20th, German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off the British and French armies in Belgium. The Allied front collapsed into chaos. Belgium fell. The Netherlands surrendered. French divisions disintegrated under relentless air attack and encirclement. Refugees clogged every road, endless columns of civilians carrying what they could, fleeing from a war that moved faster than thought. In less than 6 weeks, the German blitzkrieg had achieved what 4 years of trench warfare had failed to do. It had brought France to its knees. Trapped on the beaches of northern France, near the port of Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied soldiers faced annihilation. The sea lay behind them, the Germans all around. Hitler's tanks halted unexpectedly, perhaps out of caution, perhaps to let the Luftwaffe finish the job. In that brief pause, Britain acted. Under constant bombardment, an armada of over 800 vessels, warships, ferries, fishing boats, and private yachts, crossed the English Channel. From May 26 to June 4, they ferried soldiers back to Britain under a hail of bombs and gunfire. It was chaos, but it was also heroism. Civilians risked their lives to rescue strangers. Soldiers formed lines in the surf, waist-deep in freezing water, waiting for a chance to live. By the time it was over, 338,000 men had been saved. Britain called it the miracle of Dunkirk. But miracles are born of desperation. The rescued soldiers had left behind their weapons, tanks, and equipment. France was doomed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city, determined to avoid destruction, had declared itself an open city. French citizens watched in silence as columns of German soldiers paraded under the Arc de Triomphe. The humiliation was complete. The same nation that had stood proud after the First World War now lay broken in just 6 weeks. The French government surrendered. Northern France came under German occupation. In the south, a puppet regime was established in Vichy under Marshal Philippe Pétain, who believed collaboration was the only way to survive. But not all Frenchmen accepted defeat. From exile in London, a little-known general named Charles de Gaulle made a radio broadcast calling on his countrymen to continue the fight. France has lost a battle, he declared, but France has not lost the war. In secret, across occupied Europe, small groups of men and women began to resist. They printed leaflets, sabotaged trains, and smuggled refugees. The resistance was born. By the summer of 1940, only one nation still stood against Hitler in Western Europe, Britain. Her army was battered, her allies defeated, her empire stretched thin. But across the Channel, the German army prepared for invasion. The plan was called Operation Sea Lion, the conquest of Britain. To succeed, Germany needed air superiority. Thus began one of the most famous and desperate battles in history, the Battle of Britain. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury. Wave after wave of bombers crossed the Channel, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt fighters. Their targets: British airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories. Facing them were the pilots of the Royal Air Force, young men from Britain, the Commonwealth, and occupied Europe, flying outnumbered and exhausted. They fought in small squadrons, darting through clouds, trading bursts of machine gun fire at close range. Airfields were bombed, pilots killed, cities set aflame, but still the RAF held the skies. Then, in September, Hitler changed tactics. Unable to destroy the RAF, he turned his bombers toward the cities. London, Coventry, Liverpool, and Birmingham. Night after night, the sirens wailed, the skies turned red, and families huddled in shelters as bombs rained down. It was the Blitz, 8 months of terror and defiance. Firefighters battled infernos in the streets. Hospitals overflowed. Children were evacuated to the countryside. But the British people refused to surrender. In his radio broadcasts, Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave voice to their resolve. "We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." By October, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. British radar and home advantage had turned the tide. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. The Blitz would continue into 1941, but the threat of conquest had passed. For the first time in the war, Hitler had been stopped. Yet even as Britain endured, Hitler's ambitions grew. He turned his gaze south and east, to the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and beyond. Italy, his ally, entered the war but quickly faltered in North Africa and Greece, forcing Germany to intervene. By the spring of 1941, Europe lay under German domination from the Arctic to the Aegean. Only Britain held out, isolated yet unbroken. But across the Atlantic, another giant was awakening. In the United States, public opinion remained divided. Many still believed Europe's wars were not America's concern. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw further. He began rearming the nation and sending aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act. Weapons, food, and materials shipped across U-boat-infested seas. In Berlin, Hitler watched the Atlantic convoys with suspicion. But his eyes were already fixed elsewhere, on the vast lands of the Soviet Union. He believed that conquering the East would bring Germany the resources and Lebensraum it needed to rule the world. The Lightning War was about to reach its greatest scale yet. By the summer of 1941, the map of Europe was almost entirely gray with Nazi control. From the occupied capitals of Oslo and Paris to the ghettos of Warsaw, the swastika flew over millions. In every conquered nation, the machinery of occupation took hold. Censorship, propaganda, forced labor, and persecution. The Nazis imposed their racial ideology wherever they went. Jews, Roma, and other minorities were rounded up, confined to ghettos, or deported to camps. The Holocaust was beginning in secret, even as the wider war consumed the continent. And yet, beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Messages passed in code. Radios broadcast from the shadows. Hope survived in whispers. 2 years after it began, the Second World War had already consumed Europe. The old powers, France, the Low Countries, Poland, Norway, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, had all fallen. Britain alone stood free, battered but unbeaten. But in June 1941, Hitler would make his greatest gamble, one that would change the course of history. Turning on his former ally, he would launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Lightning War that had conquered Europe was about to meet its match on the frozen steppes of the East. The world was entering its darkest hour. The World at War, 1941 to 1942. In 1941, the flames of war leapt beyond Europe. The conflict that began with tanks in Poland and bombers over London became a global inferno, consuming continents, oceans, and empires. For nearly 2 years, the war had raged across Europe. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable, dominating the continent from the Atlantic to the Balkans. But Hitler was not content. The conquests of the West were only the beginning. His eyes turned eastward toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. And far across the world, another empire was preparing to strike. In Asia, the rising sun of Japan was burning brighter and more dangerous than ever before. The world was about to change forever. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, the eastern sky exploded in fire. Without warning, more than 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 700,000 horses, invaded the Soviet Union along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Hitler called it Operation Barbarossa, the greatest land invasion in history. For months, Stalin had refused to believe the warnings. His generals, diplomats, and spies all told him that the Germans were massing on the border. But he thought Hitler would not risk war on two fronts. He was wrong. The German assault hit the Red Army like a thunderbolt. The Soviet defenses collapsed. Entire divisions vanished in days. The skies belonged to the Luftwaffe. Within weeks, vast Soviet territories, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine, were overrun. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. In a single encirclement near Kiev, 665,000 Soviet troops were captured, the largest encirclement in history. German propaganda declared victory inevitable. Hitler told his generals that they had only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure would collapse. But he underestimated his enemy and the land itself. Barbarossa was not just a military campaign, it was a war of ideology and annihilation. Hitler saw the Soviet Union as both a racial and political enemy, the heart of what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. His invasion was not simply to defeat the Red Army, but to destroy entire peoples. Behind the front lines, death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht. Their orders were chillingly clear: eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone deemed subhuman. In villages and towns across Eastern Europe, tens of thousands were shot in mass executions. Men, women, and children, often with the cooperation of local collaborators. By the end of 1941, the Holocaust had begun in earnest. But even as the Germans advanced, resistance hardened. The Soviet Union called upon its people for a great patriotic war. Men and women alike were mobilized. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the Ural Mountains, where they worked day and night to produce tanks, guns, and aircraft. Entire cities were set ablaze rather than surrendered. Scorched earth, everything destroyed so the enemy could gain nothing. The war on the Eastern Front became a nightmare, vast, pitiless, and apocalyptic. It would eventually claim more than 27 million Soviet lives. As the summer of 1941 faded into autumn, the German advance reached the gates of Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city. When the city refused to surrender, Hitler ordered it to be erased. Thus began one of the longest and cruelest sieges in history. For 900 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad was cut off from the world. Food ran out. People boiled wallpaper paste for soup and ate sawdust bread. Winter turned the city into a frozen tomb. Yet still it held out. Music, astonishingly, became a weapon of defiance. In 1942, as shells fell around them, the Leningrad Philharmonic performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, broadcast on loudspeakers to inspire hope and to tell the Germans, "We are still alive." By October 1941, German tanks were within sight of Moscow. The Soviet capital prepared for evacuation. Panic spread. Many believed the city would fall within days. But then came the Russian winter, early, brutal, and relentless. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms, froze in their foxholes. Engines ceased. Guns jammed. For the first time, the Blitzkrieg had met a force it could not outpace: the cold. Then, in early December, fresh Soviet troops arrived from Siberia, elite divisions equipped for winter warfare. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army counterattacked. The Germans were driven back from the gates of Moscow in chaos and disbelief. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Hitler's lightning war had stalled, and the Eastern Front became a grinding war of attrition that would decide the fate of Europe. While Europe burned, Japan had been expanding its empire across East Asia. Since 1937, it had been at war with China, a brutal conflict marked by atrocities such as the rape of Nanking. By 1941, Japan's military dominated large parts of China and eyed the European colonies of Southeast Asia, rich in oil, rubber, and tin, resources Japan desperately needed. But there was a problem: the United States. America had imposed sanctions and cut off Japan's oil supply after its invasion of French Indochina. To the Japanese leadership, this was an act of strangulation. They faced a choice: retreat or strike. In secret, they chose the latter. Drop a comment. Tell us if you knew about this history before now. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A date which will live in infamy. At dawn on December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers north of Hawaii. Their target: the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, 4 battleships were sunk, 4 more damaged, and over 2,400 Americans killed. Smoke and fire choked the harbor. The attack was devastating but not complete. The American aircraft carriers, the true heart of naval power, were out at sea and survived. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress in words that echoed across generations. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. Within hours, America declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States in return. A regional conflict had now become a true world war. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japan struck everywhere at once. Its forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong fell. Guam fell. Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, all were overwhelmed. At Singapore, the British suffered one of the worst defeats in their history. Over 80,000 troops surrendered, more than in any battle before. In the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers fought heroically on the Bataan Peninsula but were eventually captured and forced on the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands died from starvation and abuse. The Japanese Empire now stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, a vast domain ruled with iron discipline and brutal cruelty. By mid-1942, the Allies were reeling. The Axis powers seemed unbeatable. Germany deep inside the Soviet Union, Japan dominant in the Pacific, and North Africa under Axis control. But the tides of war were beginning to turn, slowly at great cost. The first sign came in the Pacific. In April 1942, American bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle struck Tokyo in a daring raid. The damage was minor, but the psychological shock was immense, proof that Japan was not invincible. Then came the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, with ships never sighting each other. It was a tactical draw, but strategically, it halted Japan's advance toward Australia. And just 1 month later, at Midway, the tide would truly turn. In June 1942, Japanese forces set a trap to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into destruction near the small atoll of Midway. But American codebreakers had intercepted Japan's plans. Forewarned, the U.S. Navy prepared an ambush of its own. Over 3 days of fierce fighting, American dive bombers struck with deadly accuracy. For Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk. Japan lost its best pilots and the initiative in the Pacific. Midway was a turning point. The empire that had expanded relentlessly now began its long retreat. By the end of 1942, the war had truly gone global. From the icy steppes of Russia to the jungles of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, entire civilizations were locked in combat. In the factories of Detroit, Birmingham, and Leningrad, the machinery of war thundered day and night. In occupied Europe, resistance movements grew bolder. And in Germany, Hitler's obsession with conquest was beginning to unravel into paranoia. But one city, one battle, would soon become the crucible of the entire war. On the banks of the Volga River, the fate of the world would be decided in blood. The name of that city was Stalingrad. Turning the tide, Stalingrad, Midway, and D-Day, 1942 to 1944. For 3 years, the Axis powers had swept across the world like a storm. But by 1942, that storm had begun to break. What followed were the battles that would turn the tide of history, fought in the snow, in the desert, and on the sea. The war had become total, not just between armies but between entire nations, entire peoples, entire ways of life. Factories roared 24 hours a day. Fields were tilled by women and children. Scientists, engineers, and workers all became part of a global machine of destruction. Everywhere the question was the same: who would endure longer? In the summer of 1942, Hitler made a fatal decision. Unable to take Moscow the previous winter, he turned south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. But first he ordered the capture of one symbolic city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. It was not only a strategic point but a name heavy with meaning: Stalin's city. To capture it would be to humiliate the Soviet leader and prove German supremacy once and for all. But in that name also lay the seeds of disaster. By August 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into ruins. Entire districts were flattened, streets turned to ash, buildings reduced to jagged skeletons. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the first days of bombardment. Then the street fighting began. Block by block, floor by floor, room by room, the battle became a nightmare of dust, fire, and blood. Snipers stalked among shattered windows. Machine guns rattled from factory halls. Men fought over single stairwells that changed hands multiple times a day. The Germans nicknamed it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. By October they controlled most of the city. Soviet forces clung to a few hundred yards along the Volga, supplied at night by barges crossing under artillery fire. But Stalin had given a single order: not one step back. To retreat was treason. To fight was survival. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets struck back. Under Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, they launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement from the north and south. The Germans, stretched thin and ill-prepared for winter, were caught completely off guard. Within days, the attackers linked up west of the city. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped, surrounded by Soviet forces in a deadly pocket. Hitler forbade retreat. He ordered them to hold their ground, promising that air supply would keep them alive. But the Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. As temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, the German Sixth Army starved and froze in the ruins of the city they had destroyed. By January 1943, their resistance was broken. On February 2nd, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered with the last 90,000 survivors. They would march into captivity, and only a few thousand would ever return. Stalingrad was more than a victory, it was a revelation. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped, crushed, and turned back. It marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams of conquest. While Europe froze, another front blazed with heat. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had pushed British forces deep into Egypt. His tanks raced across the sands, striking with the same lightning precision that had conquered Europe. But supply lines were long and resources scarce. At the same time, Britain had a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, a cautious but methodical leader. The two would clash at El Alamein, a battle that would decide the fate of Africa. Under the burning desert sun, over 200,000 Allied troops launched a massive offensive. For 12 days, artillery thundered and tanks burned on the dunes. Finally, Rommel's exhausted army broke and began its long retreat westward. Churchill announced to the world, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." It was the first major Allied triumph on land, proof that the Axis could be beaten. As battles raged on land, the oceans became their own deadly front. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting Allied convoys carrying vital supplies from America to Britain and the Soviet Union. At night, the sea would glow with burning ships, the work of silent predators below the waves. But by 1943, technology and coordination began to shift the balance. Long-range patrol planes, radar, and code-breaking allowed the Allies to hunt the hunters. Convoys sailed more safely and the Atlantic lifeline was restored. Without that victory at sea, there could have been no victory on land. With North Africa secured, the Allies turned north. In July 1943, British and American troops landed on the island of Sicily, launching the first invasion of Axis-occupied Europe. The campaign was brutal but successful, and in its wake came political upheaval. The Italian people had grown weary of war. Bombings devastated their cities. Food was scarce. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested by his own fascist council. The new government sought peace, but Hitler would not allow it. German forces swiftly occupied northern Italy, rescuing Mussolini and installing him as a puppet in the so-called Italian Social Republic. For the next 2 years, Italy became a bloody battleground. Mountains, villages, and valleys soaked in blood as the Allies fought their way north inch by inch. The once proud Axis alliance was now fracturing from within. Even as the ground war raged, the skies over Europe became a second front. From 1942 onward, Allied bombers struck deep into Germany, first by day then by night, in an effort to cripple its industry and break civilian morale. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were reduced to infernos. Entire districts vanished in firestorms that consumed tens of thousands of lives. Each raid pushed the limits of endurance, both for those beneath the bombs and those who flew through flak and fighter fire to deliver them. The moral questions would linger long after the war. But for the men of Bomber Command, it was simple. They were striking at the heart of the Nazi war machine. After Stalingrad, the Red Army pressed the advantage. In July 1943 came Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks clashed across the fields of western Russia. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, dug deep defenses and let the Germans exhaust themselves in the assault. When the counterattack came, it was unstoppable. By the end of 1943, the Germans were in retreat on all fronts. One by one, the cities they had taken were liberated: Smolensk, Kiev, and Kharkov. The Soviet juggernaut was moving westward, toward Berlin. Meanwhile, in the west, the Allies were preparing for their own decisive blow, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, it would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 4 months, troops trained in Britain, engineers designed landing craft, and spies fed the Germans false information about where the landings would occur. Every detail mattered: tides, weather, moonlight, timing. If it failed, it could set back the war by years. If it succeeded, it could liberate Europe. June 6, 1944, D-Day. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with aircraft. Thousands of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, cutting off reinforcements and seizing key bridges. Then, as the sun rose, the largest armada ever assembled appeared on the horizon. over 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 men. They came ashore at 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The landings were chaos. At Omaha Beach, American troops were pinned down under withering machine gun fire. Entire units were wiped out before reaching the sand dunes. But hour by hour, yard by yard, they pushed forward, climbing cliffs, storming bunkers, and breaking the Atlantic Wall. By nightfall, a fragile foothold was secured. The price was immense, over 10,000 Allied casualties on the first day alone, but the invasion had succeeded. Europe's liberation had begun. Over the following weeks, the Allies expanded their beachheads and poured men and equipment into France. On August 25, 1944, after 4 years of occupation, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, weeping, cheering, waving flags. French resistance fighters embraced Allied soldiers. Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, proclaiming, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." The fall of France had taken 6 weeks. Its liberation had taken 4 years, and the combined will of the free world. By late 1944, the tide of war had fully turned. In the West, Allied armies advanced toward Germany. In the East, the Red Army surged across Poland and the Balkans. From the air, Allied bombers pounded Germany day and night. Hitler's empire was collapsing, but he refused to surrender. Instead, he placed his hopes in one last desperate offensive, a final gamble in the Ardennes. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge, and it would mark the last gasp of the Third Reich. The fall of the Axis, the end of Hitler's empire, 1944 to 1945. For 5 years, the Axis powers had waged a war that consumed the world. But by the winter of 1944, the tide had turned. The conquerors had become the cornered. The hunters were now the hunted. The empire built on terror was about to crumble. December 1944. Europe was in ruins, but the German army was not yet finished. In the forests of Belgium's Ardennes, under freezing fog and snow, Hitler launched one final desperate offensive. Codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, it aimed to split the Allied armies in two, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. More than 250,000 German troops, including elite SS Panzer divisions, massed secretly in the woods. At dawn on December 16, they struck. The Americans were caught completely off guard. The thinly held Allied lines buckled under the sudden storm of artillery and tank assaults. German forces punched deep into Belgium, creating a huge bulge in the front line, giving the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. At the heart of this bulge lay the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a vital crossroads. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, led by General Anthony McAuliffe, was quickly surrounded. Cut off, low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies, they held firm in the snow and mud as German forces demanded their surrender. McAuliffe's now legendary reply was a single word: nuts. 4 days, the defenders held out against overwhelming odds until, on December 26, General George S. Patton's Third Army broke through and relieved the town. By January 1945, the weather cleared, allowing Allied planes to strike back with devastating force. The German offensive collapsed. They lost hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of men, losses they could no longer replace. It was the last major German attack of the war. From then on, the road to Berlin lay open. While the Battle of the Bulge raged in the west, an even greater storm was rising in the east. After 3 years of unrelenting bloodshed, the Soviet Red Army had grown into a vast war machine, disciplined, determined, and driven by vengeance. In January 1945, they launched Operation Vistula Oder, sweeping across Poland with staggering speed. In less than a month, Soviet forces advanced nearly 400 miles, reaching the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. Villages, towns, and cities fell like dominoes. The horrors of the German invasion of 1941 were now being repaid in kind. Everywhere the war left behind not only wreckage but vengeance, brutal, unstoppable, and deeply human. As Allied troops advanced across Germany and Poland, they began uncovering something far worse than bombed cities or burned villages. They found concentration camps, places that defied comprehension. At Majdanek, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, the liberators found skeletal prisoners, mass graves, and gas chambers. The smell of death hung over the camps. Entire worlds of families, communities, and cultures had been erased. The Holocaust, which had begun quietly under the cover of war, was now laid bare before the world. Over 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Poles, Roma, disabled people, Soviet POWs, and political dissidents, had been systematically murdered. No one who witnessed those scenes would ever forget them. For the soldiers, it was no longer just a fight for victory, it was a fight for humanity itself. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. From the west, British, American, and French armies crossed the Rhine. From the east, the Soviet juggernaut closed in on Berlin. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich was now a wasteland. Bombers had reduced much of it to rubble. Artillery thundered day and night. In the underground bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler, pale, trembling, and delusional, moved imaginary divisions on maps that no longer mattered. He ranted about betrayal, demanded non-existent reinforcements, and swore that Germany would rise again. But even his closest followers could see it was over. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final assault. Millions of shells fell upon the city in a storm of fire and dust. Red Army soldiers fought street by street, house by house, through the ruins. The fighting was ferocious. German soldiers, Hitler Youth boys, and Volkssturm militias, some as young as 14, defended every corner with fanatical desperation. But nothing could stop the tide. By April 30th, Soviet troops were just blocks from the Reich Chancellery. That afternoon, in his bunker, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His body was burned by his remaining aides. The dictator who had plunged the world into darkness was dead. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Germany capitulated unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York. Church bells rang. Flags waved. Strangers embraced. After nearly 6 years of global war, victory in Europe Day V-Day had arrived. But in the Pacific, the war still burned. Across the oceans, Japan still fought on. Though her empire was collapsing, from Burma to the Philippines, the Japanese army refused to surrender. Every island had to be taken by force, every beach stormed, every mountain cave cleared by hand. The cost was horrific. At Iwo Jima, 6,800 Americans died taking a speck of volcanic rock defended to the last man. At Okinawa, over 12,000 Allied troops and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers, along with tens of thousands of civilians, perished. The closer the Allies came to Japan, the bloodier the fighting became. To break Japan's resistance, the Allies turned increasingly to the air. American B-29 superfortresses bombed Japanese cities night after night. On March 9, 1945, a massive firebombing raid on Tokyo incinerated more than 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki would later kill. Japan's cities were burning, her navy was gone, her skies unprotected. Yet her government refused to yield. President Harry S. Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his sudden death in April 1945, now faced an impossible choice. Invade Japan at the cost of perhaps 1 million Allied lives, or unleash a new and terrible weapon. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single bomb, Little Boy. In a flash brighter than the sun, Hiroshima vanished. A fireball 500 meters wide incinerated everything within 2 kilometers. 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the days that followed from burns and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 lives were gone in moments. The world had entered a new era, the atomic age. Humanity had harnessed the power to destroy itself. Emperor Hirohito, faced with annihilation, finally spoke directly to his people for the first time. His voice, calm but broken, echoed across the radio. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Formal surrender documents were signed on September 2nd, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. The numbers defy imagination. Over 60 million people had perished, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, orphaned, or homeless. Europe was a shattered continent. Asia burned from end to end. Yet amid the ashes, something extraordinary emerged. A determination to build a better world. In 1945, the United Nations was born, a global attempt to ensure that such horror would never happen again. The Nuremberg trials brought Nazi leaders to justice, establishing new principles of international law. Old empires fell and new nations rose from the wreckage. Echoes of war. But the peace that followed was uneasy. The atomic bomb had ended one war and begun another. As the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers, the Cold War began, an ideological struggle born from the ashes of World War II. Borders shifted. Alliances hardened. The world entered an age of both hope and fear. And yet, for all its destruction, World War II left one enduring lesson, a truth carved in blood and memory. When hatred and tyranny go unchecked, the cost is beyond measure. But when free nations stand together, even the darkest night can be overcome. From the ashes of Stalingrad to the beaches of Normandy, from the ruins of Berlin to the shattered cities of Japan, the story of World War II is not just one of destruction, but of resilience. It is the story of humanity at its worst and at its best. It is the story of us. Drop a comment. Let us know who you think reshaped the World War II. The aftermath, rebuilding a shattered world, 1945 to 1950. When the guns finally fell silent, the world looked upon itself and saw not victory but ruin. Cities were gone. Borders erased. Families shattered. The war that had begun with flags and slogans ended with ashes and silence. Now came the hardest part, rebuilding what had been destroyed. The war had left an open wound across the globe. From Warsaw to Tokyo, Berlin to Manila, there were no victors untouched by loss. Entire cities had ceased to exist. In Germany alone, more than 70% of major urban centers were flattened. Warsaw was a skeleton, over 80% destroyed. In the Soviet Union, 27 million had perished. Whole regions were depopulated. China had lost an estimated 20 million souls. Across Europe, tens of millions were homeless, wandering through rubble, searching for loved ones who would never return. Trains carried not soldiers now, but refugees, displaced people, survivors of camps, prisoners of war, and orphans. Millions drifted across a broken continent, carrying memories more unbearable than hunger. The victors faced a paradox. They had won the war but inherited a world that barely functioned. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each power ruled its territory, but with sharply different visions for the future. In the West, the Allies sought reconstruction and democracy. In the East, Stalin tightened control, dismantling factories and transporting entire industries back to the Soviet Union as reparations. In Japan, the transformation was no less dramatic. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the once militarist empire was disarmed, democratized, and reformed from the ground up. The emperor was stripped of divine status, though retained as a symbol of national unity. For the first time in its history, Japan adopted a constitution that renounced war entirely. But for millions of ordinary people, daily life meant something more immediate: survival. Food shortages, disease, and poverty stalked the ruins. Winter came again, and with it, hunger. Children played in bombed-out streets, their laughter echoing through the shells of buildings where their parents once lived. Yet amid the devastation, the world took its first steps toward justice. In November 1945, in the German city of Nuremberg, 24 leading Nazi officials stood before an international tribunal. Their crimes were catalogued in detail: crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, individuals, not just states, were held accountable for their actions in war. The evidence was overwhelming. Film reels from concentration camps, testimonies from survivors and soldiers, documents signed in cold ink ordering the extermination of millions. Some tried to justify, others to deny. But the verdict was clear. 12 were sentenced to death, others to life in prison. The Nuremberg trials were more than retribution. They were a declaration that civilization would no longer excuse evil in the name of obedience. That law would stand even when morality had failed. Even as the trials unfolded, a new hope was emerging, a global effort to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. In 1945, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to establish the United Nations. It was the spiritual successor to the failed League of Nations, but born of blood and necessity. Its charter began with a simple, powerful pledge: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The UN General Assembly and Security Council were created to mediate disputes, promote peace, and protect human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would soon follow, a promise that the dignity of every human being, regardless of nation or race, must be defended. For a world still haunted by genocide and destruction, it was a fragile beginning, but a vital one. Yet even as the ink dried on the UN Charter, another divide was already forming, one that would shape the next half-century. The wartime alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had always been a marriage of necessity, not trust. Now, with the common enemy defeated, deep ideological tensions re-emerged. In the East, Stalin's Red Army occupied much of Eastern Europe: Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Communist governments rose swiftly, backed by Moscow. To Stalin, this was a security buffer. To the West, it was expansion. Winston Churchill would soon call it what it was. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. In the West, the United States sought to rebuild Europe as a bulwark against communism. In 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall unveiled a massive recovery plan, the Marshall Plan, promising billions in aid to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. Factories restarted. Currency stabilized. Cities rose again from the rubble. For Western Europe, it was a lifeline. For the Soviet bloc, it was a challenge and a warning. The Cold War had begun. Meanwhile, the shadow of the atomic bomb loomed large over humanity. What had ended the war in the Pacific now threatened to end civilization itself. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic weapon, shattering America's monopoly on nuclear power. The arms race was born, a terrifying contest of science, fear, and pride. Nations began to stockpile not just weapons but nightmares. Children learned to duck and cover. Cities built shelters. The peace that followed World War II was not the peace of comfort, but of caution, a balance balanced on the edge of annihilation. Beyond Europe and the superpowers, the war had also awakened new voices. The voices of those who had fought and died under empires but received no freedom in return. From India to Indonesia, Vietnam to Nigeria, independence movements surged. The war had exposed the hypocrisy of colonialism, How could nations fight for liberty abroad while denying it at home? In 1947, India won independence from Britain after decades of struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. But the joy was shadowed by tragedy, partition, and the birth of Pakistan, which unleashed one of the largest migrations and bloodiest upheavals in history. Across Asia and Africa, one by one nations began to rise from colonial rule. A new world was forming, not of empires but of peoples. In Europe and Japan, the years after 1945 were marked by both hardship and rebirth. Cities that had been rubble turned into symbols of recovery. Factories reopened. Children went back to school. Music returned to the streets. In Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, transformed a defeated nation into a modern powerhouse within a decade. In Japan, democratic reforms, American aid, and hard work sparked a rapid recovery that would astonish the world. Even Britain and France, though burdened by debt and loss, found renewal in cooperation and modernization. The human spirit, resilient, stubborn, hopeful, refused to die. As the years passed, monuments rose on the battlefields, and silence returned to places that had once echoed with gunfire. Names like Normandy, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Stalingrad became sacred, not for what they were, but for what they meant. The survivors told their stories. The dead were honored, and historians began to weave the fragments of memory into the fabric of understanding. World War II was not simply a conflict of armies, it was a conflict of ideas. It was the moment humanity looked into the mirror and saw both its capacity for destruction and its power to rebuild. The war reshaped everything: politics, technology, society, even the very map of the earth. It gave birth to radar, jet engines, computers, antibiotics, and nuclear power. It redefined the meaning of freedom, justice, and responsibility. But most of all, it left behind a warning, one that still echoes today. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The generation that fought World War II grew old, but their memories remain our inheritance, a compass for every generation that follows. The story of World War II is the story of the 20th century itself, of how humanity was nearly destroyed by its own hands, and yet found the strength to rise again. From the ruins of empires came nations. From despair came unity. From death came the determination to live. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons have no end. Thank you for staying with us. If you're not already subscribed, do so now so you don't miss our next video. Hit that bell icon to get notified. See you in the next video.